includes, this is a bill that's only passed the House right now, nearly $1 trillion for state, local, and tribal governments to help run essential public services, everything from helping with schools and first responders and public health. It strengthened small business programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, extended federal unemployment, and also had a jobs credit that I helped lead, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. It is an expansion of that, something that will help businesses keep people on the payroll. It is a tax credit, so it's not something you go out to a lender for. It is directly with the IRS and is a refundable tax credit, so helps businesses have money right away. This is something that was put in the CARES Act, but it was much more limited. We expanded in the HEROES Act. I'm happy to talk about that more, but something that's been very bipartisan and you could use in conjunction with paycheck protection. So when your paycheck protection is done, you could use the Employee Retention Tax Credit to help with wages. But we have this piece of legislation, which we passed in May, was not considered by the Senate. And so we are still trying to keep negotiations going for some type of package, some type of relief package that would address things from housing to unemployment, to support for business and state government. This is an ongoing effort. It's been contentious, and unfortunately, it's been over 3 months now. So just to give you context, we're in September now, for those of you who haven't realized, because I'm still coming to make sure that I remember we're in September already, but the federal fiscal year runs out at the end of September. So we're in FY21 starting October 1st. When we go back, which will be the week, we're all back, the Senate and the House, the week after Labor Day week, is when we have to keep the government funded for the next fiscal year and try to move forward on negotiations on any type of relief package to move. So this is going to be a key time here in the next few weeks to try to get something moving. You'll hear, you'll start seeing countdown clocks that the government will shut down on October 1st if legislation's not passed, because it has to be passed before midnight at the end of September. So that is the task ahead of us. And so you're going to see probably some merger of these efforts, packages put together to try to address not only relief, but federal funding. There could be a short-term effort, a long-term effort. Those are things I think we're waiting to see where that nets out. But that's the critical work that needs to happen if we're going to get something that is supported by the House, the Senate, and would be signed by the President, so that you actually have resources that are available to you and know what programs are in place. We can pass legislation like we did the HEROES Act in the House, but some of the programs I'm talking about that are in that aren't available to you till we get it through the Senate and signed by the President. And so there's a lot of work happening there to try to make that happen, and something that I'm spending a lot of my time trying to do too. Your stories are incredibly important, because it's really what's happening to you on the ground that helps inform what legislation will work and be helpful. So I really appreciate you sharing your stories with us. We're trying to also bring some of those forward in hearings that we're having to talk about the direct impact on communities. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, where we are the Trade Committee, the Tax Committee, Healthcare Committee, Retirement Security Committee, and so we're in one of our subcommittees on tax policy. We're going to be trying to do a lot to talk about what we need to do to continue to support businesses. So your stories help me share with folks what we need to do. So thank you for taking some time today. And let's just open it up and we'll talk about and go whatever direction makes sense, depending on the questions or feedback that you have for me.
Thank you so much. So I know we've got a number of people on here that will probably have some questions, and you did talk about wanting to extend some things and things being held up. what do you foresee in terms of the unemployment insurance and the PPP specifics that are being talked about? So, for example, for us, 501c6s were not included in the PPP before, and I know a number of chambers are kind of at the brink of closing their doors because of that, and just curious if that is being talked about as being included in this next package.
So that's definitely something that's come up. We have separate legislation specifically on 501c6s to try to get support there. So something that we've been working on is still controversial for some. So this is going to be part of the negotiations. And I can't tell you exactly how it will net out, but it's definitely something on the table that we're aware of the impact, and many of you have shared that with me too. So like I said, we have a separate bill to try to address that, but really anything that's going to move is going to be part of this greater package that we're trying to negotiate through. So I'd say we haven't gotten to that level of detail yet because really the biggest issues are, should there be any support for state and local government? What type of support would you give to schools, et cetera? And so I do think that these are places where they're more likely areas where we can come to agreement, and we just haven't gotten that far yet. On unemployment extension, et cetera, the terrible thing for a lot of families is the break, the inconsistency. One of the things that I've been pushing for, and a group of us in Congress have been pushing for, would be to have what we call automatic triggers that say, based on certain economic metrics, we would extend a program, for example, extend unemployment, federal unemployment, or start to decrease it or roll it back if we see economic numbers improve. So we don't have those today, which means Congress has to act every time to keep things going. And as I see your faces, you all know that that is not an automatic process and definitely creates a lot of uncertainty. So we've been pushing for that. We have legislation that would put these triggers in place so that those would drive whether a program goes forward or not, versus waiting for Congress to act. Even if folks agree on certain aspects, right, they end up in these bigger packages, they're contentious. And so disagreement on one issue can stop movement on something we agree on and have a big impact. But we did include unemployment extension, the $600 extension in the HEROES Act. That has also been controversial, not only the number, whether it should move forward, and the president has tried to do something here with an executive order, which is a very ineffective way to address unemployment. He also asked for states to come up with some of the money when they've been cash strapped. And also as you know, with employment security, our state employment security department, we're overwhelmed trying to stand up new programs or make changes is hard to keep that going. And then obviously they had fraud attacks on their system that impacted and slowed down the process of people getting their unemployment checks for a while. So we have to keep that in mind too, that whatever we pass and do has to be something that we can move quickly on and make it as streamlined and easy as possible, which is why things like I talked about the employee retention tax credit, we're building on a program that already exists so that if we can get this passed, we don't have to go reinvent the wheel and take months of an agency trying to stand up a program and not get resources to people right away.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat so that we can keep this streamlined. Next question we have is there any kind of initiative, federal or state level, to open safely, increasing testing, wearing masks, contact tracing, or any other methods?
So we've been at the federal level, and part of the legislation that we've been pushing for is to make sure we have resources for testing, to make sure that we have resources to help communities and states with personal protective equipment. But the biggest thing though that we can do, we can provide resources, dollars to try to help, but really we need a coordinated federal response on the supply chain. because the supply chain has been the problem. One of the biggest problems in terms of testing rolling out more broadly is access to testing materials, whether it was swabs or reagents. There are some new technologies coming out on testing, but again, it takes time for those to be deployed, especially rapid testing, which is so important, because testing that is slow, where you don't find out for 10 days or so, has been incredibly challenging, and definitely challenging for businesses or hospitals and medical providers. If they have to wait too long to find out, then you either have to assume someone's positive while you're waiting and put a lot of resources and isolate someone who may not need to be isolated, or vice versa. If you don't find out fast, maybe someone doesn't get the treatment they need as soon, or is quarantined as early as they need to. That delays contact tracing, and all of those go together. So definitely the state has been working, the State Department of Health and governor have been working on what the requirements are in different parts of our state, what it means to reopen, and what the phases are, and where we are in that process. But our biggest job is to make sure those resources are available to help our communities, and then also to help kind of on these national issues. Something that I think the federal government and the administration has done a really poor job of, which is the supply chain side. And I still hear from folks struggling to have reliable, consistent supplies for personal protective equipment. And so that's a place where I think more needs to change. That's not necessarily a policy driven as much as it needs to be administratively driven, and we're behind.
Okay, thank you. The question that I get a lot from restaurant owners is, has there been any consideration on maybe some different specific things to help different industries? For example, industries like restaurants that have such small profit margins that are still open and deemed essential. They have basically a slow bleed to the death right now. They have a lot of new restrictions and personal protective gear that they have to buy, and they're down to about 25 to 50% of their capacity. And we're going into the rainy months in a lot of the United States, where these outdoor patios are not really going to be able to be utilized, and we'll start seeing many restaurants going under specifically. So just curious if there's any conversation around things like that, where there's specific industries that might be getting hit harder, even though they're doing takeout, they're kind of slowly bleeding.
So there's the broad programs like Paycheck Protection, and then what we're working for on Employee Retention Tax Credit, which would help, which are resources which are available to all businesses. But we do have specific legislation for restaurants in particular, called, surprisingly, the Restaurants Act. And I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation. It would create a grant program, $120 billion grant program to provide relief for restaurants through 2020. The program is something that would be administered by the Department of Treasury, and so there's certain requirements in terms of definition of what types of organizations fall under the legislation. So there is and I can get people who want more detail specifically on that bill, but it also is set up to kind of like what you see with Paycheck Protection, to also help cover overhead expenses like rent or mortgage, utilities, et cetera, as well as to help with payroll. And so, but this one's specifically targeted, and funds specifically targeted for restaurants, to your point. That has not passed yet, but that's a piece of legislation that that I've been supportive of too, and we're trying to move that forward, and potentially something that would be considered as part of a bigger package too. But we'll see if we can get what happens in negotiations on that.
Great, thank you. John, I saw that you had your hand raised. Do you have a question for the Congresswoman?
Yeah. Hi, how are you,
Good,
Congresswoman
how are
DelBene?
you?
Good. I just wondered if you were following some of the action on the PPP where banks were basically processing larger loans before small business loans because the incentive or fee was greater because some small businesses with relatively small PPP applications have been waiting a long amount of time, and banks are basically processing seven-figure PPP loans in front of those.
So definitely, first I just want to say to folks, if you're having issues in particular, please reach out because it's helpful for us not only to know, but also to find out if there's something that we can do to be helpful too. We know at the very beginning, definitely businesses who had stronger relationships with banks were moving forward more quickly. Some of those were larger businesses because they did more banking. Some of our smallest rural small businesses, minority owned businesses had the hardest time getting access. They were kind of what we would define as underbanked, and folks weren't willing to take the risk on them as quickly, especially when all the terms weren't out there for banks to truly understand exactly what they had to live up to. So they went with folks that they knew well. So then when we passed additional legislation after the CARES Act to put aside money specifically for those who were underbanked, so that there would be resources available there that would be directed, that would also support smaller banks who traditionally might work in some of these communities. And so that has been that was an effort to address some of what you were talking about. But, and I know helped broaden, that was kind of that second wave of PPP, and helped make sure that smaller businesses and businesses who had been denied access or made access was very difficult, to make sure that there are resources available to them. But if there are specific challenges that you faced, it's helpful for us to know too. So
You have caseworkers?
Yes.
Okay, that's what
So I have
okay.
caseworkers in my office. Kelly, who is Kelly Marquardt, who is on here with us, can get that information and put you in touch with our caseworkers who are working on these issues specifically to either try to find out what's gone wrong that shouldn't have happened, or to make sure that we understand what's happening so we can address that if it needs to be addressed legislatively in the future. Now, the employee retention tax credit, the reason I'm a big fan of this and have been pushing this in the HEROES Act is because it's a tax credit that would cover, it's a small tax credit right now as it was put in the CARES Act. So the program exists, but it's very small. If you use PPP, you couldn't use the employee retention tax credit. And what we did in the HEROES Act is we said, we're going to make the employee retention tax credit a much bigger benefit. And we are going to allow you to use it in addition to a PPP loan. So people didn't have this either or situation. So you could use the PPP loan, and then you could use employee retention tax credit, for example. You just can't use both of them to cover the same wages over the same period of time. The employee retention tax credit, it will, in our legislation we're trying to move, would become an 80% credit, up to 80%. And it would cover up to $15,000 of qualified wages. So the way we set up the legislation was for 3 quarters, because we passed it a while ago. We started on that legislation a while ago. So $45,000 per employee per year of qualified wages. You could have up to 80% of that covered. So $36,000 per employee for the calendar year. And there's no lender, and there's no issues of forgiveness, et cetera. Your credit would be based on the losses that you've had over the previous year. Once you hit that credit, it won't go down. It might go up if your losses are greater, but you at least have that predictability. And basically, when you're sending money to, like, for example, payroll taxes to the IRS would work with you and net that out, so that you just would send less money to the IRS. So you'd get the tax credit kind of in hand right away. Or if they owed, the IRS owed you more to cover that tax credit, then you get that money right away. It's not something that would be settled at the end of the year. So, because we know cash flow is important. But part of the reason I bring up the employee retention tax credit is because it doesn't have these issues in the same way of working with a lender and worried about, you know, who's working with who. It's directly with the IRS, so there's not that middleman there, and not some of the questions that folks have had about forgiveness and what happens, to just make it as clean as possible. So I'm hoping we can still get that through.
Would every organization and business be eligible for the employee retention tax credit?
So the way we set it up, it is available for organizations up to 1,500 employees. And then there's some benefit available after that, but smaller. Even local government could use it. That's something that was in our original legislation. The Senate has talked about moving something similar in this area, but for example, they took coverage for local government out. So we're trying to work through that, but our original legislation was broad in terms of allowing a lot of access there. So.
Any other questions? Raise your hand or speak up or put something in the chat.
Or you can give me all the answers too. I'll take those back with me too.
So question just came in, the tax credit applies only for full-time employees, is that correct?
Victoria, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it kind of depends on the size of the business based on the number of full-time employees. So the way that it works and what we did in the Jobs Credit Act is for businesses with 1,500 or fewer full-time employees, you're able to count qualified wages for the amount of time that employees are working, and then for 1,500 and above, there's a different definition for qualified wages. And I'm happy to. I can also send everybody a fact sheet on the employee retention tax credit and an FAQ as well.
Great. And I know I repeat this a lot because the employee retention tax credit exists today, not in the way that I've just described. It's much smaller. It only is a 50% credit, only covers up to $10,000 of wages, period. So 50% of that 10,000. So not nearly as much, not over a longer period of time. I say all this to say we're still working to try to get this passed. So what I'm talking about is what we're trying to do, not what's available to you right today. That's why I wanna. Now up on my website, which is delbene.house.gov, there's a COVID-19 tab on my website. And we have resource guides, one on small business and specifically talks about the programs that are available. So in those, we only talk about what actually has been implemented, you know, and is in law that you can use now. But what I'm talking to you about with the expanded employee retention tax credit is something we're trying to get to happen to address some of the questions like John had. There's also an overhead component to it. That also would cover things like utilities or rent, similar to what you have in Paycheck Protection. But they're both tax credits. There's not the same percentage that has to be covered for things to be forgiven. Those issues don't exist in the employee retention tax credit side. I think Victoria just put the link to the resource guide in the chat if you're looking for that on my website, and we'll also get you more information like she talked about on the tax credit, the specifics behind the tax credit that we're trying to expand.
Great, thank you. And we can send that link out to everybody who was on here as well. Leslie, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I was just, so I'm in the education field, and I was just wondering if you have heard any talks about resources to help, like, what was it, 4 years ago we had the SES program, the Leave No Child Behind, and I'm just watching so many kids get left behind. I think like 30% of Mukilteo School District didn't log on in the spring last year. So there's going to be a lot of students left behind. And I'm just kind of wondering how we can catch them with the resources that they had with the SES program, or if there's any going to be any services for, you know, parents are kind of trying to find their ways to educate the kids. But now the online program's working great. So I've heard the first few days of school is running pretty smoothly if everyone can get logged on, and if everyone logs on. You know, when you have two parents out of the home, I don't know how apt Johnny is going to be to get on that computer. I mean, a lot of them are, but a lot of them are going to get left behind. So I just don't know. I wonder if there's any chat going on how we're going to save students.
There's the conversation of what we need to do right away. I definitely think your point will also have to be part of longer term conversation that we all have in terms of what resources do we do, especially as we are recovering from this, kids are going back to school, and deal with the gaps that students see. What we have a couple things. One, we've been looking at childcare, childcare broadly. First, we have early learners who aren't in school yet, but parents are struggling because they, you know, a lot of childcare providers are small businesses that are struggling greatly right now. So we have legislation. One is the Child Care is Essential Act. We have another bill to help providers to get through, kind of to Samantha's point on restaurants, right? It's very hard for childcare providers right now. They can't take as many, those that are open, you know, they can't have as many children, or not as many families are participating. So how do you keep going when your revenues are down greatly, and you also want to make sure you have all the precautions for workers, et cetera, to make sure it's a safe place. So we have legislation there to try to help. Also a lot of resources in the HEROES Act, this relief package we're trying to pass through the Senate. Part of that, when we talk about local government, a chunk of that is also to help schools, because it's everything from, you know, there are some students in some districts who have special needs, who are going onto campus. Some teachers are still going into the school to do their programming, as opposed to doing it from home. So everything from PPE and cleaning supplies and things like that are expenses that people didn't necessarily plan for originally. We have big issues in terms of broadband. If you look at my district, it goes from down here in Kirkland out to the mountains, but up to the Canadian border. We have, you know, a great technology area here in King County where people have access much more. But as you start going up to, especially eastern Snohomish and Skagit and Whatcom into the mountains, they don't even have good cell service in a lot of those areas. And so there isn't an opportunity for kids to log on. And so we have issues where we have to think of what we can do instead. Libraries have been very helpful to serve. Folks are trying to put up hotspots up in Skagit County. They have school buses that drive around to be mobile hotspots. But when you don't even have cell service, you don't even have something for a hotspot to feed off of, so it can make it more of a technology challenge. So we've got a ton of work to do there in terms of access, in terms of dollars and resources to help. And the last thing I'll say is, for our youngest kids, it's one thing for a high school student to be online. It's still a very hard environment. It's really hard for kindergarten to be online, and everything in between. So I think there's the other challenge that families are facing, and the disparities that we see in our communities that pre-existed the pandemic have just grown even greater. And I think that's to your point as well. We have to realize that these things that we need to address, whether it's affordable housing, rural broadband, or just general poverty that folks are falling further behind right now. Some parents have options to hire, or people have created pods of students and brought someone in to tutor them. There are people have options. There are some people have no options, and then the gaps there are going to be much greater. So it's going to be an effort. Our community it's not just going to be a federal effort. It's going to have to be an effort across the board. But we are going through the funding process. And so programs like you're talking about in terms of funding programs for schools, that is happening more generally through as we look at the fiscal year 21 funding, but that isn't as targeted to address the pandemic and the pandemic related issues as things like the relief packages we're trying to pass now are. And then there's going to have to be more conversation about how that will change long-term legislation going forward to address disparities as well.
Thank you.
Any last questions before the Congresswoman has to sign off? All right, well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to the Kirkland business community. And we, as the epicenter of the epidemic originally, we have definitely been hit hard. So we appreciate you listening to the concerns of our business community.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And please, this does not have to be our only conversation. So please reach out. Like I said, Kelly is a contact here in King County, and the delbene.house.gov has all of our contact information. But we'll also do our best to keep you updated as things change, because they could change quickly at any time right now. But please, thank you for the work you're doing. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll stay in touch and let you know how things are going in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
Bye. Thank you.